A new report revealing California scientists overinflated the pollution levels in that state by 340%. Critics say it was all to push a green agenda. Businesses in the state warning this legislation will cost them millions. My next guest says this was all a scam. Chris Horner is with the Competitive Enterprise Institute. All right, Chris, now this was legislation that's already passed. It is draconian pollution control standards passed in California in the year 2007 based on this faulty assessment of emissions in the state. What do you make of it?
Well, this particular example is a diesel regulation. The third recent example of this same regulatory body in California, the Air Resources Board, or CARB, overinflating inputs to their computer models to get lurid scenarios to lead to these draconian regulations. Now, this is a giant red flag because California voters go to the polls in 3 weeks to possibly suspend their first ever state implementation of essentially the Kyoto Global Warming Treaty unilaterally, which will, of course, kill millions of jobs. They're claiming they're going to centrally plan a green economy as the first in the world, even though it's been a train wreck throughout Europe. And this red flag tells the voters to remember. CARB is probably not trustworthy on this. At bare minimum, it's a good time to delay and review, because delay and review would have found this problem sooner and the other two.
Chris, I've got to tell you that we talked to the California people, we put this problem to them, and they came up with this statement. I'm going to quote directly from it, Chris. This, that is the 340% inflation of emissions levels, this had nothing to do with faulty science or calculations. The equipment wasn't being used or had been sold due to lack of business. That's from the California Air Resources Board, the spokesperson therefore. Now, that's their statement. They say it was faulty equipment. What do you make of that? I mean, it just seems to me that a 340% overestimation is a bit too much to be a simple mistake.
Yeah, I suppose we need to ask them which time they're telling the truth, which is their excuse. And remember, it is an excuse. They're not saying they didn't make a mistake. They're offering several changing examples, explanations why they made a mistake. First, it was because, it was the recession. We haven't reduced diesel use 70%, even in California, thanks to the recession. That's an absurd argument, so now they're spinning a little more wildly. You have to remember, when you premise trillion-dollar policy decisions on computer models and you let the same bureaucrats who stand to gain tremendous power and budget authority, if the scenarios are lurid, well, don't be surprised when the computer model scenarios are indeed that. As we continue to find in California, they're overinflating inputs to get lurid outputs, and voters need to consider this, because in 3 weeks they can suspend what will be economic suicide.
Now, we're talking about the California situation. Extrapolate out onto the national scale. Do we see anything similar out of Washington, D.C.?
Oh, yes. EPA is now being sued by several groups, including ours, for their global warming backdoor attempt to do not cap and trade, just the cap, the regulatory energy tax. And they haven't, again, they've outsourced their science to a body called the UN IPCC, which relies on similar computer models, more complex, but proven wrong. They have been proven to overinflate the emission inputs again. They overinflate the impacts of those inputs. They underestimate the impact of teeny little influences on climate, like the sun.
Let me jump in.
Yeah, this is a microcosm.
You say this is deliberate.
Well, what I'm saying is California has a lot of explaining to do, but the biggest, as they get their story straight, the voters need to take into account that they have a pattern. 3 under the law is a pattern. They've got 3 similar examples, and now they're being trusted with implementing essentially economic policy for the state, essentially economic suicide through this AB 32, and the voters have a chance with Prop 23 to suspend AB 32 to look for more of this, and I suspect they will find it.
Chris Horner, always a pleasure. Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Stuart.
Why the